Here we go. Steve Kettman has joined us on Sports Byline. He's authored or co authored more than 15 books, including 7 New York Times bestsellers. His most recent project is Crossroads, Dusty Baker's highly anticipated memoir from Crown, which he worked on as the co author. Previous books as author include One Day at Fenway and Baseball Maverick, How Sandy Alderson Revolutionized Baseball and also revived the New York Mets. Steve is a former reporter for the New York Newsday and also the San Francisco Chronicle. Let me ask you about the book with Willie Mays. What did you think and how did you develop how you wanted to present this story? Because you had to have a feel for it. You had to have a feel for him as well. So how did you go about that?
Well, I'll go back and tell you a story from a few years back in the 1990s when I was a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. And my best friend on the baseball beat was a guy named Pedro Gomez, who was known later as an ESPN reporter. And we were guys that liked to, experience the nightlife wherever we went at that time. We were young fellas. And after the annual baseball luncheon, every year that there would be one for the A's and Giants writers, we were just hanging out, Pedro and I, and Dusty came over. I didn't even know Dusty. And he said, "Where are you guys going?" And I looked at Pedro like, should we tell? Because we were going to go to this dive bar in the Tenderloin. And I didn't really want to tell him. And Pedro's like, yeah, just tell him. So I told him, and Dusty just said, "I know the place." He didn't say, "I'll meet you" or anything like that. So Pedro and I went over there. This was, early afternoon. Great bar. I think it was the Blue Lamp or the Blue Lantern anyway. And there was a really cool bartender, this woman we were talking sports. We had completely forgotten that Dusty had said he would come by. But Dusty came on into the place. We spent an hour or so there just talking. So I was never a Giants beat writer in Dusty's era. I was an A's beat writer. So we didn't have the normal stuff where any manager's going to have his moments of frustration with the beat writer. Dusty and I never had that. We just kind of liked each other the way you and he just kind of liked each other. And we always had that friendship. So years later, I lived in Berlin for 10 years. I reported for Wired and New York Times and other places. And I came back to California, started a writer's retreat center in Santa Cruz, California, and decided that if I was going to try to inspire young writers and work with them, I needed also to be producing books. And so one idea I had was, the great Bill King. I worked with Ken Korak on a memoir about Bill called Holy Toledo that got Bill in the Hall of Fame. And I was at Cooperstown with people telling me, "Hey, if you and Ken had not done this book, Bill would never have got the frick and been enshrined at Cooperstown." And then another idea I had was my favorite story was Dusty Baker when he was a young man getting tickets to go to the Monterey Pop Festival, see Jimi Hendrix, play, blow his mind, but then burn his guitar. And so I suggested we do that. And so Dusty and I did that book, a little book that I published through Wellstone Books called Kiss the Sky. And, that got written about in the New Yorker magazine. And Dusty and I had a great time doing it. So, but I was also careful. I was savvy enough about publishing. I'd already done some New York Times bestsellers that we kind of bit off a piece, so it was a little book and it didn't preclude a big major memoir with a major publisher. So Dusty and I kind of always figured we would do this at some point. When we started, Dusty talked to you about it. I want to give a shout out to Joe Branch, who's one of Dusty's agents. And he was big early on the idea of Crossroads, which was my idea as well. Because really, when you think about it, life is full of moments that challenge you. And a big difference between someone like a Dusty Baker and a lot of others is Dusty always learns from it. He always, like Hank Aaron taught him. And so it's not just about trying to make the right choice at the right time. It's about what are all the things that go into making sure that you carry that forward throughout your life as a reference point.
Was there any challenge in capturing Dusty's voice for this book?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't mind telling you straight out, Ron. I did that earlier little book, Kiss the Sky, and we worked very hard on it, no question. But it was it was kind of a quick, fun project. And we put it out there. Dusty loved it. But then years later, he told me that there were just a couple of places in the book where we might have refined the voice just a little bit. So Dusty, if he were still here, he'd laugh about it because he kind of created a monster where I am known in the business, the book business, as being an extremely hard worker. I did a book with Terry McAuliffe before he was governor of Virginia. I made him read out loud the entire book twice, and this is a long book. And I work very hard myself, but Dusty, when he challenged me like that, I decided from there that we were going to work even harder. And I'll tell you, Dusty is a remarkable man who the amount of work that he put into this the last 2 years, I don't mean it was all drudgery. A lot of it was fun. We had fun, but it was the thing of making sure that you have it right, going back in and revisiting some of the same moments he's discussed with you, again and again to make sure it's all kind of lining up. That is hard emotional work for anybody to do. And the fact that Dusty and I really did the emotional work, that's how you make sure that you get the voice if you've really explored the material.
I think about when he grew up and playing in Atlanta, which he said he did not want to go and do, and all the things that he had to deal with being an African American. I think the military was probably one of the best things for him for a period of time because it disciplined him in a way maybe he did not, had not been disciplined before. He talked about the tantrums that he used to have and everything. But the one thing I've always known or sensed about him is there's no cynicism in him. He's not an angry black man over what he was not able to do during parts of his life.
Well, I would agree 100%. There's no cynicism there. And, I would credit a lot of that to both of his parents for how they raised him. But in the work on the book, one thing that we did was really delve down into the question of anger because, of course, Dusty has anger. We all have anger. And if you were an African American growing up, when he grew up and having some of the experiences, which he explores in the book, um, it can make you angry. And that was something that he learned early on that if you let anger get to you, then it can consume you and you can't be the person that you want to be. Well, as a white person, I was especially, uh, intentional about exploring that with Dusty again and again and making sure that together we didn't make any easy assumptions because it's not easy. It was not easy for Dusty to navigate that. And he wanted to be really honest about it, but he also wanted to make sure he never came across as, an angry man because that's not who he is. But it's like, you got a little dash of anger makes for a composite personality that has a lot of a strong will to prevail. You can't take out the anger, but you also have to look at it for what it is. And I think that's one thing about his book, Crossroads that's really so interesting, to be honest, is that through line of when does anger come up? How do you handle it? How do you get ahead of it sometimes? But you cannot suppress it because that leads to internal damage.
I think when I mentioned to him during the course of the interview, Dusty Baker has the most wins among African American managers, he realized how important that was and how unfair it was. Because, as I pointed out, Cito Gaston had won 2 World Series and never got another chance to manage after that. And I think he realized that what he had done was substantial, and he was proud of that.
Yes, absolutely. I would call him up and tell him, have you noticed where you are on the all-time list of managers? And he'd say no. And I'd tell him about some forgotten manager that he literally didn't even know about, who he was, about to pass up and wins. And he didn't, obsess over that kind of thing. But sure, at the end of the day, you look at his career totals in managing, and he's on the leaderboard all time for managers.
Seventh.
Yeah, seventh. And you look around him, there's not going to be a lot of movement there. The only one is Tito Francona, who's, got any kind of shot, but probably he's going to be seventh on the leaderboard for a long, long time. And that's pretty amazing.
What do you think is the single thing he's most proud of?
I think the single thing that he's most proud of is always having the ambition and determination to find new ways to be great at what he does, to always include other people, and to respect and honor other people, to surprise him and show them that they're worthy of the faith and trust and respect that he's given them. And I think that putting that package together has made him someone who's brought a lot of joy to what he does. He's brought a lot of joy to other lives. You see it when he moves on from a city and the players miss him a lot. But then it also made him very, very good at his job.
As I said, you kind of co-authored, you ushered this along, and I'm just wondering how you feel about the work that came out, the final result.
I feel great because I've worked on 7 New York Times bestsellers. I've had a lot of projects that were a lot of work. I've never done this much work over this many years. And it's nice to be at the end. I'd compare it. My wife, Sarah, is actually a chef. She does, private chef things. And it occurred to me after a while, a lot of making really good food is doing some work, some conceptual work and prep time. And Dusty and I have done all the work to serve up a meal that we hope will be, a delicious feast for people, but that also will have its nourishing aspects. And so I'm super excited, Ron, to have you kind of putting the word out there, and then to have a lot of other people reading the book, digesting the book. Maybe if we're lucky, we set in motion a larger cultural conversation about, yes, we can learn a little bit about life and its challenges and grace under pressure from looking at great figures in sports and how they've handled themselves.
What do you want readers to take away from this book?
I want readers to take away from this book, but the greatest of the great, the Hank Aaron's, the Dusty Bakers, the Barry Bonds, the Willie Mays, that in some ways they're special figures whose lives you can't really compare to your own. But most of who they are is just like you, just like your brother or sister. And that the things that are the same inside of us are so, so much more than the others. And that Dusty speaks to that common humanity in all of us. He always sees the commonality of what people share. And I think there is a kind of emotional valence there that really can rub off on people and encourage them to see the world a little bit differently.
I have to ask you, because your background is in sports, having been with the San Francisco Chronicle, as you indicated, covering the Oakland A's and everything. Is the challenge of writing a sports book or about a sports personality, whether they be really famous or just an unusual story, is that a bigger challenge than writing any other kind of book?
Not to me. I mean, to me, as a sports writer for the Chronicle, and whether I was writing for the New York Times or whatever other publications, I always saw it as almost like Dusty, where you start with just taking the person on their own terms and then trying to see them as they see themselves. And then you try to describe events that have taken place, but then you try to put it all together. And I can give you an example if we have time.
Just a little bit, just a short one.
I probably don't have time for a short example. I was going to tell the story of Arturs Urbe, the great Sharks goalkeeper.
Right.
And if you understood what he meant in Latvia, then you understood him on the ice. And that's the kind of thing that I would get after. Just the bigger picture, and don't get too caught up on what's different. Think more about the commonality.
Well, Steve, we've known each other for a long time. Outstanding writer, and some of the books that you've done, as I said, you have authored or co-authored more than 15 books, including 7 New York Times bestsellers. And of course, this work, the latest one, which is Crossroads, about Dusty Baker's life and also his career, is just outstanding. I urge everybody to check it out. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. A true pleasure.
We continue across the country and around the world. It's good to be with us on America's sports talk show, Sports Byline. That was 1453. so you can. Yeah.
So we're
Great.
good?
Yeah.